Hello, I'm Kelly McFarland, and this is Diplomatic Immunity from the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy. Welcome to the second episode of our sixth season of Diplomatic Immunity, looking at the geopolitical and economic fallout from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Today we're talking with oil markets expert Gregory Brew. In the aftermath of Russia's invasion, energy prices skyrocketed worldwide. Reminiscent of previous energy shocks, it caused political consternation around the world, and especially in Russian energy-dependent Europe. Greg and I discuss Europe's efforts to wean itself away from Russian gas and the larger geopolitical consequences of energy shocks.
My friends, I want to talk to you today very simply about government.
I also believe that events in Iraq have reminded America of the need to use diplomacy.
This is not a time to undercut our diplomats.
Gregory is an analyst with Eurasia Group's Energy, Climate, and Resources team, focusing on the geopolitics of oil and gas. And he also serves as Eurasia Group's country analyst for Iran. Greg is a historian of modern Iran, oil, and U.S. foreign policy, and has authored multiple books on the history of modern Iran and the international oil market, and has published analysis and commentary in Foreign Affairs, Time Magazine, and The Washington Post. Greg holds both doctorate and master's degrees in history from Georgetown University. We encourage listeners to check out his latest book, The Struggle for Iran: Oil, Autocracy, and the Cold War, published in January 2023. Let's listen in to my conversation with Greg. Happy to welcome Gregory Brew. Greg, nice to see you again, and welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kelly. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Well, as we discussed ahead of time, we're talking about all the different ways that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has sort of upended the world that we knew before February of 2022. And today we're going to talk to you about oil, energy supplies, and all that kind of fun stuff to talk about how this might have changed things. So give our listeners a little bit of background into what exactly energy supply chains looked like in Europe prior to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and what role Russia played in that, basically.
Sure. So, it's a really interesting history because you can go back to the Cold War, really. You can go back to the history of the Soviet Union. Back in the 1950s, 1960s, the Soviet Union started producing a lot of oil and a lot of natural gas. And given that it was, positioned very close to Europe, very close to major markets in Western Europe, it made a lot of sense from a commercial standpoint for Europe to look to the Soviet Union for energy supplies, both oil and particularly natural gas, which could be moved by pipeline over land. And obviously, as one might expect, this created a lot of friction between the United States and Europe during the Cold War. The US obviously didn't want Europe to embrace an energy relationship with the Soviet Union in the midst of the Cold War, in the midst of the US-Soviet global competition. But it really was something that the Europeans were very interested in doing, particularly the Germans. Germany is this massive industrial economy, huge factory output, a need for tremendous amount of energy. And other than its coal deposits, Germany didn't have a lot of energy resources to draw upon. So it made sense from a German economic standpoint to import energy from the East. So the energy relationship between Russia and Europe goes back decades, and it really became even more solidified during the 1990s and the early 2000s, when there were concerns about peak oil. There were concerns about global, not energy shortages necessarily, but prolonged periods of high prices, and this encouraged European consumers, European governments, to embrace even closer relations with Russia, which of course was this is the post-Soviet period, 90s. Russia is this sort of new entity, this new state that both Europe and the United States is interested in integrating a little bit more into the global economy. But this all begins to change by the 2000s, right? By the time that Vladimir Putin has emerged as Russia's sort of de facto ruler, his sort of permanent president, Putin becomes very interested in using energy to expand Russia's geopolitical, position. Right? Coming out of the 90s, which was a period of tremendous economic, political turmoil for Russia, Putin offers this sort of deal to the Russian people, which is political stability, economic growth, largely based on energy exports. And a lot of those exports went to Europe, right before the outbreak of the war in Ukraine, Europe was taking something close to, over a third of Russian gas exports, a considerable amount of its oil exports. And Russia similarly depended on European consumers as a market.
By Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you mean 2022. So they're still doing this post 2014, 2013 as well.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. I mean, you go back to 2013, 2014, the crisis in Crimea, Russia's annexation of Crimea. I think that starts the really serious conversation between the US and Europe about whether or not this European dependence on Russian energy exports is a good idea, right? Russia has emerged as a destabilizing actor. It's emerged as an actor that the United States sees as a competitor, as a force for instability, not just in Europe, but across multiple geographic areas. But again, the Europeans push back. Angela Merkel, the Chancellor of Germany, makes it pretty clear that Germany will continue to tie its energy future to access to Russian energy. And this is where, the Nord Stream 2 controversy comes from, the divisions between the United States and Germany over whether to build more pipelines. But from an economic standpoint, it just made too much sense to Germany to just continue to import Russian energy. It was the cheapest, it's the closest, commercially it makes sense. So it created this contradictory, paradoxical position where Western Europe relied on a destabilizing actor for most of its energy. And of course, everything blew up as soon as Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022.
So you mentioned the way that Putin decided early on that he was going to use the energy tool as a geopolitical weapon. And he's selling oil and gas to Europe, but there's more to it than that, too, right? There's this notion of strategic corruption and the way that not only do they sell gas to these countries, but they also use it as a weapon. Can you talk a little bit about that and how they use companies like Gazprom and all these different entities as major conduits of strategic corruption?
Sure, sure. So, I mean, this is something that Russia sees geopolitical gains from, right? Using its energy wealth to influence the politics, particularly of Western and Central Europe, where it sees the greatest amount of leverage that it can exert. The corruption, it comes in insidious ways, and then it comes in very mundane ways, where you have, major German politicians going to work for Russian energy companies, right? It looks like corruption, but in some ways it's just how these businesses do business, right? Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, was Donald Trump's Secretary of State. There's always interlinkages and overlaps between oil and gas and politics. But I think for Russia and for Putin, I should say, I mean, post 2000, this is really about Putin's position as Russia's de facto ruler and the ways in which he's organizing a government, organizing a regime that uses corruption or uses the wealth and commerce of energy for geopolitical and political purposes. And I think for Russia, it made sense to ingratiate various aspects of European political communities with its own energy infrastructure to exert the maximum amount of leverage. And I think when it comes to leverage, Ukraine was at the top of Putin's list. In the wake of Ukraine's sort of political revolution, which triggered the Crimea crisis, Putin saw retaining control or influence over Ukraine as a top priority for Russian security, for his sort of vision of Russia's position in the world, the future of Eastern Europe, the future of the former Soviet bloc, and being able to exert leverage over specific European politicians, specific European political communities, worked as part of this plan, worked as part of this strategy, which came to a head with the invasion of February 2022. I think, I mean, if I could, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but I think on some level he thought I could get away with this. I can invade Ukraine. It was supposed to be a 3-day invasion, supposed to be a rapid military operation. I can do this. And the fact that the Europeans depend on my energy for their survival, for their economic survival, means they won't act. And I think he was surprised. I think a lot of people were surprised by how the crisis eventually unfolded and the impacts that it had on Europe's energy infrastructure.
Right. And I think if you're Putin, like you said, you've been spending the last 20 years, over 20 years, building this geopolitical energy infrastructure so that you can get leverage over these countries. So he probably envisioned in some ways that he could get away with this, but he didn't. And That's the next question I have, is that obviously the invasion in February 2022 put on stark display this liability of German, but also other European countries depending on energy infrastructure and energy sources coming from Russia. So, what was the US and the European response to what happened in February 2022 as far as energy is concerned?
Sure, sure. I mean, this is the big kind of historical question about what the war has done. When I talk about, I'm a historian, but I'm also an analyst of energy, and I study energy markets in the contemporary setting. And I always like to point out to people, like you got to think of energy, oil and gas as a business first and foremost. It operates under commercial logic. You find the cheapest source and you send it for the highest price, and that's very often what's happening. It works as a business, except when it doesn't, except when geopolitics and war and conflict and political upheaval get in the way. And that's what's happened in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Initially, we can all harken back to the heady days of early 2022. Initially, there was a lot of trepidation among the Europeans and the Americans about sort of expanding the sanctions on Russia into energy. There was a lot of concerns about the kinds of destabilizing effects that cutting Europe off from Russia would have on energy markets. At the same time, however, I think it was very clear early on to President Biden and the German government that this needed to happen. That Europe could not continue to rely on Russian energy while Russia was at war in Ukraine.
Yeah, you're ostensibly paying for Russia's war.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, politically, it was an untenable position to maintain. Strategically, it was also a bad idea, right? You don't want to be importing energy from the state that you're trying to defeat. So what the Europeans and the Americans did was, I think, a somewhat more gradual process of cutting off Europe. I mean, the United States cut off Russia immediately. There was an immediate ban on imports from Russia. But then again, the United States wasn't really importing much from Russia. Most of Russian energy that was going to be affected was going to Europe. And the Europeans went about it a little bit more gradually. They took months to get to a point where they would cut off imports of Russian oil, imports of Russian products. They shut off Nord Stream, the first Nord Stream pipeline. Nord Stream 2 never went online. And then, of course, both pipelines got blown up, in late 2022. So obviously no gas was moving through there. There's still Russian gas going into Europe. And there has been since the beginning of the war. But what the Europeans have done have been, consciously moved their consumption towards other sources. They're taking a lot more from the United States. They're taking more from Norway. They're taking more from North Africa. They're taking more from Qatar in the Persian Gulf. So what you've had in the wake of Russia's war is a forced shift in the flows of energy. I mean, right now, there's Russian oil going from the Baltic to India. That makes no sense commercially, but it's the world that we're living in right now as the result of this war.
And talk a little bit too about the infrastructure itself, too, right? Like the war happens, and it's not like when you're that dependent on one country, it's not like Europe can just like flip a switch and say, oh, well, we're not getting oil from you anymore, or gas from you anymore. We're going to go over here. Like there's infrastructure issues at play here that make this more of a long-term project, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the big shift that's happened has been in the ways in which Europe gets its energy, and specifically how it gets its natural gas. I mean, that's something also to keep in mind. I mean, everybody loves to talk about oil prices. Everybody loves to talk about how this caused a huge spike in oil prices, how this disrupted the oil market. Oil markets ended up being sort of okay. We didn't actually lose a whole lot of supply. The price shock went back down. It was sort of leavened off. What the war has really done has had a dramatic impact to natural gas and the flows of natural gas worldwide. And the interesting aspect there, from an infrastructural standpoint, is that, before the war, Europe was getting most of its gas the old-fashioned way, by pipeline, right? It was being piped in from Russia. That's how most natural gas moved throughout the world until very, very recently. What we've seen in the last 10 years has been the emergence of a global market for natural gas through the movement of LNG, liquefied natural gas. This is a much tougher process, takes a lot more time. You have to construct elaborate infrastructure, import-export terminals, freezing apparatus to lower the temperature of the gas to the point at which it could be liquefied and moved by ship. But Thanks to those technological advances and thanks to the addition of new infrastructure in Europe, the construction of new LNG import terminals, Europe can now get most of its gas not by pipeline, but by ship. It's shipped in the form of LNG. A lot of it comes from the United States, right? The US is now the world's largest producer and one of the world's largest exporters of natural gas, which is something that would have blown minds 20 years ago. The idea that the US is now shipping gas worldwide. So that's another way this war has radically altered the global energy landscape. Not only do we now have a global market for oil, but increasingly there's a global market for natural gas as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned Qatar and the ways that, oil is a business, but it's also affected by geopolitics. And the war obviously affected geopolitics beyond Europe. And specifically in light of what happened with the US, the Biden administration and their diplomacy towards the Gulf and specifically with Saudi Arabia. Can you talk a little bit about how this has affected geopolitics and energy supply chains a little bit more with an eye towards the Gulf and the Middle East?
Sure, sure, sure. So, like, as I mentioned before, the United States is now producing a lot more oil and gas than it was before, thanks to the shale revolution, thanks to the ways in which the U.S. is now unlocking previously unlockable sources of oil and gas, and that's had a significant impact on the global energy market. What it also did was start a conversation in the U.S. about the future of U.S. relations with the Middle East and with the Persian Gulf specifically. Right? We're now seeing a lot more questioning of why the U.S. needs to be close to these Gulf monarchies, particularly Saudi Arabia. Why the U.S. needs to continue to be friends with these states if we really don't need their energy anymore. This was a going concern. And what the war did, I think, was that it brought home this idea that energy markets are global. A shock in Europe is going to have ramifications on the United States, even if we don't import Russian oil, even if we don't import Russian gas. The price of oil skyrocketed in 2022. The price of gasoline skyrocketed. And this had immediate domestic political impacts. So I think the takeaway from the war, at least from a US point of view, the point of view of the Biden administration, was that we can't give up on the Gulf quite yet. That there does need to be some kind of relationship with the Gulf oil producers, with Saudi Arabia, because they continue to have significance in the global energy market, right? What the Saudis have been doing over the last several years has been progressively cutting their oil production to push prices higher, right? And that goes against what the US wants, what the Biden administration wants, which is lower energy prices, lower gasoline prices. So what the war has done has been, I think, boosted the significance of this relationship, at least in the eyes of US policymakers. What we're seeing right now, what we were seeing before the crisis in the Middle East, and what we're probably going to be seeing again in the not too distant future, is this push from the Biden administration for a grand bargain with Saudi Arabia, some kind of big deal that would link Saudi to Israel, that would link Saudi to the United States, with sort of an implicit suggestion that this would make Riyadh a little bit more cooperative when it comes to managing energy prices. So that's how I see the war sort of playing in to the US perceptions of the Gulf. But again, from the point of view of the Persian Gulf, from the point of view of energy producers, the war has it's sort of reaffirmed how they see themselves, which has crucial states for the global economy. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, they see themselves as being very, very important for global economic growth, global economic forecasts. They are conscious of the energy transition and climate change, but they continue to believe that fossil fuels are going to continue to fuel economic growth for the foreseeable future, if not forever. So from their point of view, this war has boosted their significance a little bit. And I think from the US point of view, the point of view of US policymakers, the outlook has been somewhat similar. I think they see the Gulf as being a little bit more important than they did before the war began.
Right. We can't completely walk away from there like some have wished, I think. But you mentioned the green transition, and we're almost 2 years into this now. How do you see this kind of overall shifting energy infrastructure and supply chains in the next 5 to 10 years? And there was also a number of people when this war started, and all the discussions talked about weaning the Europeans off of Russian gas and oil. there was a lot of discussion around like this is the window to speed up the transition to green energy and the green revolution. So is that happening? Was that sort of, more pie in the sky visions of speeding up to a green transition? How is that playing into this as well?
So, what the war did, I think, is that it emphasized the importance of two things. And those two things are security and cost. So, for the Europeans, and also for countries like Japan or even China, these large industrial economies that have to import a lot of energy in order to keep their economies going, what the war really emphasized was that you can't always depend on energy sources to be there when you need them. The risk of geopolitical shock is always there, particularly when you're relying on states that are in sort of unstable situations, or states like Russia that could potentially make a big move to destabilize geopolitical status quo. So it's brought home this problem of security. And in many cases, the answer to the security question has been energy transition, right? Why import natural gas or oil when we can build wind turbines, when we can build solar panels, when we can build nuclear power plants? The response from Japan has been, let's reactivate some of our dormant nuclear reactors that we shut off after the Fukushima disaster. And that's largely been done with a view towards security rather than depend on unstable sources. So, in that sense, it has had an impact on the course of the energy transition. I think it has emphasized that in many cases, renewable energy is a safer, more reliable source when it comes to insulating yourself, securing yourself from geopolitical shocks. The corollary to that is the question of cost. What the war in Ukraine did was send energy prices sky high. The price of oil, the price of natural gas, even the price of coal increased. And this brought home and is continuing to bring home to developed economies, as well as the economies of the global south, what the future looks like as far as finding affordable, dependable sources of energy. Are your cheapest sources going to continue to be fossil fuels, or would it make more sense to build up infrastructure for renewable energy? I mean, that's a complicated question when you also remember that like a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the technology that you need to develop renewable energy sources also has to be imported. And it has to be imported from places like China, which for the United States poses a security problem along with a cost problem. So building up your own green energy or your own green industry, that's a viable option if you're the United States and you have this massive, economy, this big industrial base that you can spin up through something like the Inflation Reduction Act. For the Europeans, it's a little harder. For the Japanese, it's a little harder. For the global South, it's much harder because you don't have the existing industry. So, it's about balancing. I think the response has been, how do we find more secure sources of energy? How do we make that work within our budgets? And how do we do it? Again, how do we do it with an eye towards reducing emissions? I mean, everyone is conscious of reducing emissions. Everyone is conscious of the threat of climate change. But governments have to find ways to make it work within their means. And the question of who's going to pay for all this is a question that, in the context of high interest rates, in the context of fighting global inflation, is a problem that has even greater salience, right? Finding the money to pay for all these projects is going to be a big problem over the next 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, and we talked about the transition from the Europeans away from Russian gas and oil for two reasons: to get rid of the leverage that Russia had over them, but also then to cut off funds to Russia. So they've been able, for the most part, or in a large way, to get rid of that leverage aspect. But has that been effective in cutting down the finances coming into Russia as far as oil and gas sales have gone? Or has Russia been able to shift to other buyers?
So the question is, Russia continuing to earn from its energy exports? Yes. Are they earning money from the Europeans? Yes, but a much smaller amount. So as far as like the Europeans not wanting to send money to Russia that Russia then uses to fund its war machine in Ukraine, that's, I think, largely been accomplished. We've seen innovations like the G7 oil price cap on Russian oil exports, this attempt to only allow Russia to export oil below a certain price, which was enacted at the end of last year. The price cap seemed to be working for a little while prices were low. It's lost a lot of its effectiveness when prices started to increase the end of this summer. Russia's also taking advantage of the fact that there are now a large number of oil tankers, so-called shadow tankers, or sometimes it's called the dark fleet, which is very ominous.
Well, it sounds very Star Wars.
Yeah, it is very Star Wars, the dark fleet. But what these tankers do is that they don't use Western insurance, which was the main way that the price cap was being enforced. They don't use Western insurance. They turn off their transponders so nobody knows where they are. And they move Russian oil to markets in India, China, and elsewhere outside the cap for prices that very often go above the cap. So Russia is still earning plenty of money from exporting energy. The thing about it is that to a certain extent, that's what the United States and the Europeans wanted. The big problem facing the US and Europe was how do you punish Putin? How do you pressure Putin without taking Russian energy off the market? Because if you take Russian energy off the market, you have a massive,
Yeah, much
massive,
bigger problem.
right? You've got prices sky high, you've got supply coming off. So what they tried to do, I think, what they tried to do is largely what has happened, which is move Russian energy into different markets, right? We don't want to depend on Russia anymore. So we're going to move to different sources. We don't want to pay Russia anymore. So we're going to get Russia to sell to somebody else. So, Russia's still making a lot of money. It's maybe not making as much as it was in the past. And it's under heavy sanctions, which, over time will start to impact its ability to produce energy. But the big goal for the US and the Europeans was how to avoid price spikes, how to avoid instability. And they've largely succeeded in that objective.
Yeah, and getting rid of that big blackmail opportunity. The leverage that Putin had over Europe with his gas supplies. I think that was a key factor in moving away from that. Is there sort of one or two things that you kind of think about that we should be on the lookout for in the coming months, year, as far as energy markets and supply chains go?
So I think as far as absorbing the impact of the war, I think that's largely been finished, right? I think the war's effect on energy markets has now largely been absorbed and flows have shifted. The Russian oil and gas is moving in different directions than it was before. Europe now seems to be mostly out of the weeds. It's moving into another winter with pretty ample inventories of natural gas to draw upon. It can get enough supply. So as far as like absorbing the shock of the war, energy markets I think have largely moved on. One of the big problems, one of the big questions facing the oil market in 2024 is a question of durability of demand. Like the question of, we mentioned how this war may have accelerated the energy transition. We've seen a great increase in the global number of electric vehicles. We've seen an increase in the use of renewable energy sources for electricity. 2024 may also be a year of fairly sluggish global economic growth. So the big question for oil producers, particularly the producers in OPEC, is what price do we want to target, and how much power do we have to enforce that price? Like right now, OPEC Plus, I should say, has taken a lot of barrels off the market to try to push prices higher, and they've succeeded, to a certain degree. But moving into 2024, prices may start to fall off as global demand looks, weaker. And the question for oil producers is how do they respond? Do they try to cut more production and take an even greater haircut, right? If you can't produce, you're not going to be making as much money. Or do they ease off and let the market sort of balance itself, which could send prices rock bottom and impact them even more in the short term? So 2024 is looking to be a tough year for oil producers, particularly if demand doesn't pick up to where they want. From the point of view of the United States or other big consumer countries, it may end up being a slightly better year as far as prices are concerned, but there's always the risk of a shock, right? The current crisis in the Middle East has raised the question of will we see an oil shock? Will we see a disruption in oil supplies, particularly from Iran? Iran is now exporting a lot more oil than it was a year ago. There's a mounting pressure in the United States in Congress to do something about that. And for as long as the crisis in the Middle East continues, I think we're going to continue to see pressure on that point. So, moving into next year, it's hard to see what kind of crisis might emerge. And it's possible that prices might be a little lower than what they've been in the last year or two. But there's always the risk of a new crisis on the horizon.
Right. Yeah, we definitely know that over the past few years. There's been a lot of talk about China's economy lately, whether it's going down or whether it's, leveling off now or maybe even heading back up. What role is China's potential economic slowdown playing into this?
A huge role. A huge role. I mean, China is probably the most important oil consumer in the world because it consumes so much and it imports so much. So the future of oil demand and the future of sort of the oil market depends in large part on what kind of growth we see from China next year. And whether it is, if it is encountering a sort of sectoral slowdown, if we are starting to see a real shift in Chinese economic activity towards a slower, more sluggish growth projection over the next couple of years, that's going to have an impact on oil demand. What's interesting is that so far, oil demand in China hasn't really been affected by these signs of economic doldrums. China is still importing a lot. It's refining a lot. China has, arguably the largest refinery complex in the world. So a lot of what it imports in crude, it ends up producing and then very often re-exporting in refined products like gasoline, diesel, heating oil, that sort of thing. So China, even if it starts to slow down next year, China still might be one of the big drivers of global oil demand, probably next year and for the foreseeable future. But it all hinges on China, I would say. The U.S. economic outlook could be a little iffy. The EU economic outlook could be a little iffy. Growth in the global south, particularly in India, is another big indicator that OPEC and others look to. But very often, it all comes down, what is China doing? Where is China going over the next 12 months?
All right. Thanks, Greg. Good stuff as always. And it was good chatting with you. And thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you again to Gregory Brew for his time and thoughts. And a reminder for listeners to check out his latest book, The Struggle for Iran: Oil, Autocracy, and the Cold War, published in January 2023. Tune in next Thursday for our next episode of Headlines in History, where we'll deep dive into an update on the military and diplomatic situation in Ukraine. This episode was produced by Jarrett Dang and Freddie Mallinson. Thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for their support for this podcast. Be sure to check out any episodes you may have missed via our website. Please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you listen, and tell your friends and colleagues to come find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else they listen. Follow us on Twitter @geodiplomacy, and visit our website, isd.georgetown.edu, to learn more about our work. I'm Kelly McFarland. Until we meet again.